They say you can't put a price on family history. Well, Karen from the HOA tried. She offered me $50,000 to donate my grandfather's barn to the community. When I refused, she decided to take it anyway. Big mistake. Nobody steals from my family and gets away with it. My grandfather's barn has stood proudly on our family land since 1923. It's not just any old building. It's a piece of our family's heart and soul. I remember him telling me stories about how he built it with his own two hands, working from sunrise to sunset, placing each wooden beam with care and pride. The barn's red paint might have faded over the years, but the love and memories it holds never will. When I inherited the barn last year after my grandfather passed away, I promised myself I'd keep it standing strong just like he did. The old structure still looks beautiful against the countryside, its weathered wood and iron fixtures telling stories of countless harvests and family gatherings. Local folks often stop by to admire it, saying how barns like this aren't built anymore. They're right. My grandfather knew what he was doing when he made those thick walls and that sturdy roof that's protected our family's equipment for nearly 100 years. Everything was peaceful until Karen moved in as the new HOA president of the fancy neighborhood that was built near our land 5 years ago. At first, she seemed nice enough, stopping by one sunny morning with a basket of muffins and that big fake smile of hers. "I just wanted to welcome you officially to the area," she said, even though our family had been here long before her precious HOA even existed. While eating her muffins, which were actually pretty good, Karen kept looking at the barn with this strange gleam in her eyes. "You know," she said, stirring her coffee, "that barn would make such a wonderful community center. The HOA has been looking for a historic building to use for our meetings and events." I nearly choked on my muffin. The barn wasn't for sale, and it certainly wasn't going to become an HOA clubhouse. I politely explained that the barn was a family heirloom and not available for community use. Karen's smile tightened, but she nodded and said she understood. Looking back, I should have seen the warning signs and how quickly she changed the subject and started asking detailed questions about the barn's history and my grandfather's ownership papers. A week later, I noticed something odd. There were fresh footprints in the mud around the barn, and someone had clearly been peeking through the windows. My neighbor Tom told me he'd seen Karen and some HOA board members walking around the barn taking pictures when I was at work. They didn't have any right to be on my property, and it made me uneasy. Then came the generous offer, as Karen called it. She showed up at my door one evening with an official-looking envelope. Inside was a check for $50,000 and a proposal for the HOA to preserve and maintain this historic structure for the benefit of the community. She acted like she was doing me a favor, saying how expensive old barns are to maintain and how this would take the burden off my shoulders. I didn't even think twice before handing the check back to her. "The barn's not for sale," I said firmly. "Not for $50,000, not for $500,000. It's staying in my family." That's when I saw Karen's true colors come out. Her friendly mask slipped for just a second, showing an angry flash in her eyes before she caught herself. "Well," she said, her voice suddenly cold, "I hope you understand that having such an old structure in our area comes with certain responsibilities. The HOA has standards that need to be met, even by adjacent properties." The thread in her voice was clear as day. After she left, I found some HOA members hosting a meeting in their clubhouse. Through the window, I could see Karen pointing at pictures of my barn on a big screen. The words "community historical asset" were written at the top of her presentation. My stomach dropped. This wasn't over. Karen wasn't just going to walk away after I turned down her offer. She was planning something, and I had a feeling things were about to get much worse. That night, I dug out all of my grandfather's old papers from the attic, deed records, building permits, newspaper clippings about the barn from the 1920s, everything. If Karen wanted to fight over my family's heritage, she was going to learn that some things are worth more than money, and some people aren't as easy to push around as she thinks. I went to sleep that night with my grandfather's words echoing in my head. This barn isn't just wood and nails, kid. It's our family story, standing tall for everyone to see. I made a silent promise to him that his barn would stay standing, no matter what Karen and her HOA tried to throw at me. Little did I know, this was just the beginning of a battle that would test just how far I'd go to protect my family's legacy. Would you like me to continue with Section 2, keeping the same simple language and emotional connection? Things started getting weird around the barn about a week after I turned down Karen's money. At first, it was small stuff. Garbage mysteriously appearing around the barn, empty soda cans and food wrappers scattered near the entrance. I knew it wasn't just random littering, because our property sits far back from the main road. Someone was doing this on purpose. Then one morning, I found a bright orange notice stuck to the barn door. It was from the HOA, claiming they'd received multiple complaints about the barn's condition. According to them, it was an eyesore and potentially unsafe. I nearly laughed out loud. The barn was in better shape than half the new houses in Karen's neighborhood. My grandfather had built it to last, and I'd kept up with all the maintenance just like he taught me. But things got serious when I checked my mail later that week. Inside was an official-looking document that made my blood boil. It was a letter claiming that part of my property, including the barn, actually sat on HOA land. They'd included a map that had clearly been altered. The property lines were all wrong. I'd lived here my whole life and knew every inch of this land. They were trying to use fake documents to steal my barn. I started asking around town, and what I learned made me even angrier. Karen had been going to local businesses, telling people that my barn was abandoned and that the HOA was trying to save it. She'd even gone to the coffee shop where my grandfather used to have breakfast every morning, spreading lies about how our family had let the historic building fall into ruin. The same people who'd known my grandfather for decades were being fed these ridiculous stories. The next incident really crossed a line. I came home from work to find two men in hard hats walking around the barn with measuring tapes. When I confronted them, they said they were from a construction company, hired by the HOA to assess the structure for safety violations. I kicked them off my property immediately and called the police to report the trespassing. The officers took my report, but warned me that without clear proof of Karen ordering these inspections, there wasn't much they could do. That's when I noticed the damage. Someone had scraped away patches of the barn's paint and taken pictures of the exposed wood underneath. They were trying to make it look run down on purpose. I was furious but also worried. What else would they try to do to my barn when I wasn't around? I decided to fight back with facts. I contacted the local historical society, and they were incredibly helpful. They found newspaper articles from 1923 showing my grandfather building the barn. They even had old aerial photographs of the area from the 1950s, long before Karen's precious HOA neighborhood was even a blueprint. The Historical Society president was outraged when I told her what was happening. That barn is one of the last original structures from our town's farming days, she told me. We can't let them destroy this piece of history. While digging through my grandfather's old files, I hit the jackpot. Hidden in an old work boot in the attic. Grandpa was clever with his hiding spots. I found the original property survey from 1920, along with every single receipt for the barn's materials. He'd kept everything, right down to the invoice for the last nail. These yellowed papers were gold, absolute proof that the barn was built on our land with our money by our family. But Karen wasn't backing down. If anything, getting caught in her lies made her more determined. She started holding HOA meetings specifically about the barn situation. My friend who lives in her neighborhood secretly recorded one of these meetings on his phone. Karen was standing there, pointing at pictures of my barn, telling everyone how it was dragging down property values and endangering their children. She even suggested that it might have been built without proper permits, a complete lie, and that the HOA had a moral obligation to take control of it. The final straw came when I found boot prints in the fresh paint I'd just applied to the barn door. Someone had tried to break in. The lock was scratched up, and there were marks where they tried to force it open. They hadn't gotten in, thanks to my grandfather's solid old padlock, but the message was clear. They weren't going to stop. I realized I couldn't just sit back and document these incidents anymore. Karen and her HOA cronies were getting bolder, and I needed to protect my property. The time for being nice was over. If they wanted to fight over my grandfather's barn, I was going to give them one they'd never forget. That evening, I made 3 important phone calls. One to a security company, one to a lawyer who specializes in property rights, and one to my Uncle Mike, who'd recently retired from the local newspaper. Each of them would play a crucial role in what happened next. Karen thought she could bully me into giving up my family's heritage, but she was about to learn a hard lesson about messing with the wrong farmer's grandson. Would you like me to continue with Section 3, maintaining this level of detail and personal connection while keeping the language simple and clear? I knew I needed solid proof to fight back against Karen and her HOA schemes. So my first move was installing security cameras all around the barn. I put up signs warning about video surveillance too, all completely legal and visible. The cameras connected directly to my phone, so I could watch everything happening around the barn in real time. It didn't take long to catch them in action. The very next day, my phone buzzed with alerts. There was Karen with 3 other HOA board members, walking around my barn in broad daylight, like they owned the place. They were taking pictures of every little thing. A loose board here, a faded paint spot there. The best part? My cameras caught them pulling up weeds and scattering them around the barn to make it look neglected. I saved every second of that footage. But the real shocker came when I checked the county records office. My Uncle Mike, the retired newspaper guy, had a friend working there who tipped us off about something fishy. Someone had tried to file paperwork claiming the barn was built on old community land and therefore belonged to the local township, which conveniently now included Karen's HOA. The documents looked official until you looked closer. The dates were wrong. Signatures didn't match, and they'd even misspelled my grandfather's name. I went into full detective mode. I started carrying a small recorder everywhere legally in a one-party consent state and documented every interaction with Karen or her HOA friends. My security cameras kept catching them trying to sneak onto my property, always with some new excuse. One time they claimed they were inspecting for fire hazards. Another time they said they were assessing historical value. Each trespass was caught on camera and added to my growing pile of evidence. The support from the old-timers in our community was amazing. People started coming forward with their own stories about the barn. Mrs. Johnson, who's lived here for 85 years, signed a sworn statement about watching my grandfather build it. Mr. Pete from the hardware store found receipts from the 1950s when Grandpa bought supplies for barn repairs. Even the retired postman remembered delivering mail to our farm for 40 years, always to the same address, with the same property lines Karen was now trying to dispute. Then I hit the mother lode. Hidden behind an old photograph in the barn, I found my grandfather's original building permit from 1923. It was signed by the town mayor at the time and had the official seal. Even better, it came with a hand-drawn map showing exactly where the barn sat on our property. The boundaries were crystal clear. No way Karen could argue with this. But Karen got desperate when she heard about these documents. She tried a new angle, filing paperwork to have the barn declared a historically significant community property that needed to be preserved under HOA management. She even brought in some fake historical expert who'd never set foot in our town before to support her claims. The threatening letters started arriving next. Official-looking HOA notices claiming I was violating all sorts of made-up rules. Warnings about fines and legal action. Even a letter from their lawyer, who I later found out was Karen's cousin, threatening to sue me for obstruction of community development. I kept every single letter, adding them to my growing file of evidence. I hired Jack Thompson, a lawyer who specializes in property rights cases. When he saw my evidence, the fake documents, the surveillance footage, the threatening letters, he actually smiled. "They've given us everything we need," he said. "They're not just trespassing anymore. They're attempting fraud. We set up a meeting with the HOA board, but Karen didn't know I'd invited some special guests. The county property assessor came, armed with official maps showing my clear ownership. 3 members of the Historical Society brought their documentation of the barn's history, and my Uncle Mike invited a reporter from the local paper just to make sure everything was properly documented. The look on Karen's face when we laid out all the evidence was priceless. The security footage of her trespassing, the falsified documents they'd tried to file, the proof of their harassment, each piece of evidence was like another nail in the coffin of her scheme. Some HOA board members started looking nervous. Clearly, they hadn't known the full extent of what Karen had been doing. But the best moment came when we revealed our final piece of evidence. Remember those community property documents Karen tried to file? Turns out the notary's stamp on them was expired, and the notary had never even seen the papers. That wasn't just dishonest, it was illegal. Karen's face went white as a sheet when Jack explained the potential consequences of submitting falsified documents to the county. The other HOA board members quickly distanced themselves from her plan. One of them even apologized to me right there, saying he had no idea how far Karen had taken things. The meeting ended with Karen storming out. But I knew this wasn't over yet. She had one last desperate move to make, and my security cameras would be ready to catch it all. Want me to continue with the final section? It's where everything comes together, and Karen finally faces real consequences for her actions. The final showdown with Karen happened faster than anyone expected. My security cameras caught her making her last desperate move at 11:30 p.m. on a Tuesday night. There she was, in full view, trying to break into my barn with a crowbar and a file full of papers. She probably thought she could plant some fake documents inside to support her claims. Instead, she got a surprise visit from the sheriff's deputies. I called the moment I saw her on my security feed. The deputies were professional but firm. They'd already seen all my previous reports, the security footage, and the evidence of her harassment. When they caught her red-handed trying to break in, there was no talking her way out of it. They arrested her for attempted breaking and entering, trespassing, and criminal mischief. Watching her being escorted off my property in handcuffs was satisfying, but the real victory was still to come. The next morning, news spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. My Uncle Mike's friend at the newspaper ran the story on the front page. HOA president arrested in failed property scheme. The article detailed everything. The false documents, the harassment, the break-in attempt, and all her previous lies about my grandfather's barn. People were shocked, especially when they learned how she misused HOA funds to pay for her fake legal documents and that historical expert she'd hired. The HOA board called an emergency meeting, and this time I was invited to speak. I brought everything. A detailed timeline, financial records showing how Karen had spent HOA money on her scheme, and statements from community members about her harassment. The evidence was overwhelming. The board voted unanimously to remove Karen as president and launch a full audit of everything she'd done during her time in charge. But the real justice came through the legal system. My lawyer filed a civil suit against Karen personally, not the HOA, for harassment, attempted property theft, and filing false documents. The case was solid gold. We had video evidence, paper trails, witness statements, and now an attempted break-in charge on top of everything else. Karen's lawyer, no longer her cousin, advised her to settle. The settlement terms were sweet. Karen had to pay for all damages to the barn, cover my legal fees, and write a public apology admitting that she had tried to steal my property through fraudulent means. She was also banned from serving on any HOA board in the county, ever. The cherry on top? She had to pay for a proper historical marker for the barn, officially recognizing it as my family's property and documenting its true history. The barn got some good out of all this, too. Once word got out about what happened, the real Historical Society, not Karen's fake expert, took interest. They helped me apply for genuine historical status, which came with grants for preservation. I used that money, plus what Karen had to pay in damages, to restore the barn to its original glory. Every repair was done exactly the way my grandfather would have wanted it. The community rallied around the barn in ways I never expected. Local craftsmen volunteered to help with repairs, sharing stories about my grandfather while they worked. Children from the nearby school came to learn about farming history. Even some HOA members who'd initially supported Karen became regular visitors, admitting they'd been wrong about wanting to take it over. The new HOA leadership turned out to be much better. They formally acknowledged the barn as private property and even added a clause to their bylaws, preventing any future attempts to seize neighboring properties. They also started an annual community day where locals can come learn about the area's farming heritage, with my permission, of course, and full respect for property rights. As for Karen, she moved away shortly after the settlement. I heard she tried to join another HOA in the next county, but a quick Google search of her name brought up the newspaper articles about what she'd done here. Apparently, HOAs don't like having someone with a record of fraud and property theft schemes on their board. Today, the barn stands stronger than ever. The fresh red paint glows in the sunset, just like it did when my grandfather first built it. The historical marker out front tells its true story, not Karen's made-up version, but the real tale of a farmer who built something to last for generations. Every time I walk past that marker, I think about how my grandfather would be proud, not just of how the barn looks, but of how we fought to protect it. Sometimes people stop by to take pictures of the barn or read the historical marker. They often ask about the story behind it, and I tell them, not just about my grandfather building it, but about how his grandson protected it from someone who thought she could steal a family's heritage with fake documents and bullying tactics. It's become more than just a barn now. It's a reminder that some things are worth fighting for and that justice, though it might take time, eventually finds its way home. The best part? Every morning when I look out my window, I see my grandfather's barn standing tall and proud, exactly where it belongs, with our family on our land, its future secure for generations to come. Karen tried to write her own version of history, but in the end, the truth won out. That's the thing about trying to steal someone's heritage. Sometimes you end up helping them protect it even stronger instead.